Well, welcome everyone. I see folks joining into the webinar and tuning in. We just want to say thank you so much for joining this afternoon. We're excited to have you. And before we get started with the webinar today, I just wanted to give a brief overview of where you are. So my name is Catherine Picard, and I'm the co-chair-elect for the Autism Spectrum and Developmental Disabilities Special Interest Group of ABCT. I co-chair this special interest group with Hannah Morton and Tyler Higgs. And our special interest group is focused on a number of different things. This slide here talks through those top priorities, and that is to conduct work that is aligned with the priorities of the autistic community, to promote meaningful and relevant clinical care, to collaborate with and learn from autistic advocates and other community members, and to use respectful and affirming language when referencing autism and developmental differences. If you are interested, some of you may already be members of our ASD SIG, but if you're not, you are more than welcome to join. The QR code here will take you to a page where you're able to register to become a member of our SIG. You're also welcome to follow us on our Twitter handle and check out our website. I want to give a plug that we do have some upcoming events this summer in addition to the panel that you've tuned in for today. We have an internship and a postdoc panel that will be August 14th, 2024. And then stay tuned for more information. We are going to be hosting our pre-conference event back in person in Philadelphia this year. And so if you are going to be in Philly for the convention, it would be awesome to have you join us. I'm now going to pass it off. We're in for a real treat today. I'm going to pass it off to Sadaf, who's going to be introducing our panelists. And we're really, again, looking forward to learning from the folks on this panel who are going to be sharing really about their intersecting identities in autistic culture. So handing it off to you, Sadaf.
Thanks, Catherine. Hi, everyone. On behalf of the Diversity Committee and the SIG leadership, I wholeheartedly welcome our panelists, moderators, the audience. We are so excited to have so many of you from all over. We'll start with briefly introducing our participants for today. Marenike is a global advocate, educator, disabled person of color, and a non-binary woman whose work focuses on intersectional justice, meaningful community involvement, human rights, and inclusion. Thank you for being here, Marenike. Victoria is a nationally renowned, openly trans and autistic self-advocate and a proud Baltimore City resident. She has over a decade of experience in the government and nonprofit sector, having started in disability discrimination enforcement at the U.S. Department of Labor. We are thrilled to have you, Victoria. Kaylee is a neurodivergent, queer, non-binary Latin activist and world traveler. Kaylee is unfortunately not able to join us today and will be deeply missed, but I want to acknowledge their unique contributions to put this panel together. Thank you, Kaylee. And now over to the moderators. Myles is a member of the Diversity Committee of the SIG, is a queer, trans feminine, neurodivergent, and Latin post-bac researcher whose research interests lie in neurodiversity, particularly with respect to the psychology of identity development and across the lifespan. Jenny is a longstanding autism community advocate and recently an autistic self-advocate. As a late diagnosed woman, Jenny brings both lived experience and professional perspectives to her advocacy work, aiming to reduce disparities. Once again, a very warm welcome to everyone. Jenny and Myles both are very dear members of the Diversity Committee, and Myles will be starting us off with the panel. Over to you, Myles.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Myles, like Sadaf said. My pronouns are she, they, and we're going to start talking now about autistic culture. And I know a lot of you might have questions like, what is autistic culture? I mean, this panel really is about like moving away from this pathologized view of autism that lots of clinicians still harbor to this day. And personally, as someone who's interested in identity development and interpersonal relationships with autism, I see it as like almost like a process. It's a personal process of how you come into yourself. It's an interpersonal process of like how you make friends and find other autistic people around you. And then societally, it has so many implications for like, what is our role in different communities? So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the panelists and ask, how do you define and conceptualize autistic culture? And what does autistic culture mean to you?
Veronica, do you want to go first or do I want to go?
Oh, go ahead, Victoria. I was actually just going to say, Myles, you might need to call us. Go ahead.
I mean, in my case, I was going to say that before, like, for me, autistic culture, like, it's hard to tell because you kind of think what defines the culture, what defines culture in general. But I would say it's the idea that autistic people need to be able to form their own identity and be able to be part of who they are, to be integral to who they are, and relate to each other, not just attached to parents, basically, not have their identities, their culture, etc., defined by other people.
Thank you for that, Victoria, and would love to hear your perspective as well, Morenike.
Okay. Yes. So thank you for, I just want to apologize to you all in advance. I am I wasn't planning to have the camera on, so you probably see a virtual room and not me. And it's a really pretty room, but it's not the way my room actually looks. But to jump in, so I guess I really like etymology. And so when I was thinking about this question, when we discussed it, I was thinking about like kind of the origins of the word culture. And it's debatable, so in some people believe that the origin is Greek, and that it is related to like calligraphy, like something that's beautiful or pretty. Other people have, are of the belief that it's more that the roots are from the or Latin, and that it addresses like culture, cultivating agriculture. So like building or guarding or tilling, something. And so really when you think about, when you think about culture as a term, it's about like the, the sense of, like connection, community, the like beliefs or techniques, ideas that are, for of a group, and it can be geographic, or it can be, kind of what's the thing that's a little more ethereal. And when I think about autistic culture, I really like what Victoria stated, because for me, I discovered being autistic and self-diagnosed, and subsequently obtained a formal diagnosis after my children. So I came in with the lens of a parent, and which is an important lens, but it isn't the same as having the lens of a person from that community. And so being autistic, for me, really is about, again, like understanding ourselves, embracing the unique aspects of being autistic, and doing so in a way that's neutral, and not, so that highlights strengths and weaknesses, and that isn't defined by others and isn't steeped in solely pathology.
That was a great response, Morenike. And from both you and Victoria, I'm really just hearing themes of like self-determination, and just having autistic people just recognized as like a distinct culture and identity group, and even people who experience oppression and ableism in different ways, and also like flourish in different settings and community settings and amongst each other. And with that, actually, Renike, we have another question for you. So an individual question. So what have you learned about neurodiversity via your history with HIV advocacy? And how has that informed your understanding of neurodiversity and autistic culture?
You know, this is a fascinating question, and it's one that I feel like I have such a sense of empathy because, you know, part of me, you know, feels like I basically as like a baby advocate, the people who nurtured me, who taught me were, you know, were AIDS activists, were people who had been active, were people who were, had, you know, been involved with the diet and all these things and really transformed the way we do clinical trials, community involvement with treatment and research advocacy, dispelling stigma. And it's obviously a community that's, very intersectional, obviously, big into the community, and a number of people from the queer community, obviously, people who are gender diverse and trans, people of color, multiple ages. And so it is something that taught me early on, like, that the community's voice is key, and it's going to be there. Either you invite us or we're gonna find our way there. And so that's what the community did. They initially attempted to be involved, to ask to be involved, to ask to be consulted, to try to share, their understanding with the quote unquote professionals, and they were, ignored and disregarded at every turn, which then required, okay, we're gonna have to take a different approach. We're gonna have to kind of by any means necessary, kind of force our way in. And so it started almost as a forced marriage. And there's still definitely, like even today, with the recent information about the presidential budget and some of the proposed cuts to the HIV community that we fought against last year, there's always been this sense of like this, grassroots, we take care of our own, we're already at the margins of the margins. We need to look at marginalization type of mentality, and understanding that lived expertise is, as well as learned expertise, are important. And so though it, and so really I feel like in a number of ways it serves as a model for what we want to see in neurodiversity, and having a very diverse community with lots of different perspectives that don't always align with one another, but establishing, themselves as, being, leadership, leaders and experts who need to have, who need to be valued and have meaningful leadership and involvement at every stage. That being said, there is also, unfortunately, in every community, there are, also challenges. So for all of the things that it has taught me about, embracing who I am and speaking up and, camaraderie and, all of those things, there's also ableism in the community as well, because it's a community that's faced, and so there is also, some, some lack of, identification or understanding of disability identity, and, and we see this with other, conditions also, chronic illness, versus, the mad pride versus neurodiversity, these kind of ropes. And so in some ways, what I've learned is that we need to speak up, we need to be present, we need to share our perspectives, we need to, be able to be involved in all areas. But I've also learned that there's things that we need to unlearn too. And that the cross movement connection is key. So it has been, and Victoria has worked in the community as well. It's been something that in some ways has been absolutely amazing. And I feel like it's, at least over a generation ahead of where we are. But certainly there's cracks in the veneer as well. And so I think that though definitely the autistic community and neurodivergent community can learn a lot from the HIV community, I think that also in HIV advocacy, there's certain things, particularly with regard to like some of the communication and some of the embracing of oneself, some of those things that we're can be learned from the other side as well.
Thank you so much for that. And I think you draw really great parallels between, queer advocacy, especially with like ACT and disability justice and disability rights movements. I think honestly, in a lot of neurodivergent spaces, there's like a lack of disability identity and lack of disability justice. And so, really drawing that like, and right, for like HIV and autistic people, like you think that disability is like a really big thing for both of those communities, but I think in a lot of spaces, even when disability is salient to the conversation, it gets overlooked. But with that, I actually want to ask Victoria, how has being involved in disability policy impacted your perspectives on autism and neurodiversity?
I mean, to be very honest, when it comes to autism neurodiversity, I would say there is, like, how do I say it? It's the constant need to ensure that self-advocates are represented, basically, that we work towards ensuring that all the voices are heard. Like, honestly, it's a situation. Personally, I am currently in government. I'm the coordinator of state autism strategy for the state of Maryland. But what I would say there is trying to acknowledge the limitations of that. Because we have to work with everyone. It's non, there are many issues where we have to be neutral on. But what I would say in that context is when you go into it is thinking, for example, how to ensure that everyone is represented, that it's not, for example, in self-advocacy, that it's not just, I used to talk about when I was at the task force about the sexy disabilities, like the ones that make it to the group picture in a way of, and thus I ask often where those who are nonverbal, where those who are on disability, where those who stutter or stim and so on, in the big self-advocate spaces like positions like mine and so on, who've had the particularly traumatic experiences that people like to talk about, but so we need to ensure that our disability advocacy is inclusive of everyone who's not just at the margins, but at the margins of even this movement. And in that sense, I feel like there is a certain level of hierarchical ableism in a way. I mean, the more classic example, let's say you tell the person in a wheelchair, at least you're not crazy, or the person with mental illnesses, at least you can walk. Sorry about the dog. I have a hound dog. But what I was gonna say is, and in autism, we have often that same problem. So we need to think about how do we ensure that everyone makes it into self-advocacy and into being part of that autistic culture.
You bring up great points, Victoria, about including people at the margins of the movement itself. Hierarchical ableism is such a problem, and across the spectrum of support needs in autism, I think there's like a huge problem with like autistic self-advocates with lesser support needs speaking over, like you said, like people who are non-speaking, who have intellectual disabilities in the autism community, and just even broader, like your example with like people who can walk and people with severe like mental health disorders. There's a lot to be said there. With that, I'm gonna hand over the moderation stick to Jenny so that we can answer some questions, including myself.
Thanks, Myles. And also, I'm in the background listening, learning, taking notes, and very honored to be here and listen to your perspectives and experiences, Victoria and Maranike. And the other thing I was also thinking about too is I know the conversation could span ages, right? So like some of us might be thinking about as young as, pre-adolescence, and some of us might think as, further in that spectrum, older adults. And so I think it's also because I'm a developmental scientist, so I think about age trajectories a lot with these conversations. So I do have a few questions I would like to ask our wonderful panelists. We have about 25 minutes allotted for some of these questions, just to kind of give people a heads up. So the first question, Victoria, Maranike, whoever would like to go first, for anyone who, oh, Myles, you're also included in this discussion. So you're joining now as a panelist during this section. So for our trans feminine panelists, how did autism impact discovering your trans identity? How did that impact your relationship with gender and feminine identity? And anyone who would like to go first, please go ahead.
And one thing I've been very clear on is, and which I've ensured that is reflected in policy, and the policies of the state when we do the strategic plan for the state of Maryland, is that trans people are overrepresented within the autistic community. Like, autistic people are more likely to be trans, and more likely to be non-binary, more likely to be LGBTQ in general. And I've myself have written on it. You can look me up in the Journal of Gender Social Policy and the Law. But about that, the topic is like, I mean, personally, I don't like going too much into my personal story. I was more the little professor type kid, if people get that reference, as childhood. And I realized I was trans way before I was diagnosed as autistic, because I flew through private schools as the twice exceptional type. But what I would say there is that any type of policy and acknowledgement, like if all you're seeing in the room of self-advocates is basically straight boys, like, we have a problem of lack of representation, basically. And because of that overrepresentation of trans people in the autistic community. And we need any policies by the state and any advocacy by self-advocacy organizations, as well as even parent organizations like Autism Society and so on, need to operate from the premise that trans advocacy is autistic advocacy, that supporting trans kids is essential to supporting autistic kids and adults, and that any autism policy making and advocacy needs to assume that it has to include no restrictions based on autism to gender affirming care, to gender affirming treatment in schools, in the workplaces, in disability programs, in medical settings, and so forth. So yeah.
Myles or Marinike, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, and I want to speak to Marinike that I think that your perspective as a non-binary woman is also valuable. And I would love to hear your perspective after my response. And I also wanted to speak to Victoria and saying, like, yes, like trans people are overrepresented in the autistic community. There's so much literature on that. We actually have a peer-reviewed journal article about that listed in our informational handout that was sent in the chat that we, as the diversity committee, put together. And I did want to speak a little bit to more of my personal experience, and in that, like, as a member of like Gen Z, I kind of grew up more with like the internet. And so as like a teenager who didn't know they were autistic, I had nowhere else to turn but like inwards and like online among other people who like either were already diagnosed as autistic or like didn't know they were autistic, but like many of them came to identify as such, like as young adults. And so we had this almost like laser focus on like naming and exploring different parts of our identities, because it just became like fixations of ours. It definitely was of mine. And so there's definitely parts of it that were like unhelpful at times, like micro labeling and like trying to like put things in boxes that maybe don't need to be in boxes. But it was so incredibly helpful, I think, having like the advantage of autistic cognition. And like going back to what I said is like autism is a process of like, I came into my queerness and like my trans identity a lot quicker and with a lot more like acceptance because of my disregard for social convention at an earlier age. So what this also meant for me is that I like felt ostracized from a lot of my peers, even peers that like were queer, but like weren't out of the closet yet or hadn't come out, so to speak. And so I really think it speaks to um, this concept of like almost like autistic people as like social pioneers in a lot of sense, not just with queerness and with transness, but with so many things. And when it comes to my like trans feminine experience, that's something that I've only really come into in the past few years. I've known that I'm non-binary for about 10 years. And I actually just like, I think that was something that autism impacted for me. I knew I was like trans and non-binary, but I didn't know the extent to which I was trans feminine or even like maybe a woman, because I just felt so disconnected from gender from such a young age. It just like didn't make sense to me. You'll find that a lot of autistic people, like for some reason, have like innate like sometimes just like hormonal differences. I think like there's I don't know that there's like in like literature on this, but I think there's like also more likely you're more likely to find like intersex autistic people. Again, don't quote me on that if I'm wrong, but oh, that's great to hear about NK. But yeah, so like I was just like a very like androgynous kid with long hair, and I had a very high voice for like the first 15 years of my life. So no one gendered me as a boy anyway. So but aside from like the not having the innate experience of feeling like a boy, I like yeah, just grew into gender in that unique way. And that's my perspective on that.
Thank you so much, Victoria and Myles, for sharing. I I really love the advice that Victoria gave about reaching out to parent organizations and really educating on trans advocacy is, in essence, autistic advocacy as well, because of the high representation of trans youth in this population. So note taken, and we'll go back. But I also love, Myles, that you brought up about your experience as a Gen Zer. And we really need to put more spotlight on Gen Zers' perspective regarding the experiences of being a trans feminine autistic individual, and turning to online, because that's our reality. Maybe some of us older folks, speaking for myself, not for anyone else who's listening, I feel like technology has evolved so fast, and I'm struggling to keep up with the conversations that are happening. But it also makes sense that because you're having to turn inward without the evidence, without the community, or being plugged into certain communities, you're coming up with these naming conventions that some, those who might not be familiar with these names and labels are showing some resistance toward this because it's new. And I think for a lot of people, when there's new labels and new names, there's resistance toward it rather than celebrating those new labels, right? So thank you for bringing that up. And Marenike, I do see your chat. You're welcome to chime in if you would like, but I can also move on to the next question for everyone.
I'll go ahead and try to just briefly because Myles did mention that, and I hope it might be helpful because I think that it's important to kind of look at the nuances. So I was assigned female at birth, and I wasn't aware that I was autistic. I like Victoria was in the gifted classes, and so I was around other people who were kind of so some of the differences that I had were attributed to culture, like the lack of eye contact with me being West African. Some of the differences I had in terms of communication and socialization were like considered, oh, okay, well those gifted kids are like kind of type of thing. But I always like I think about the fact that I didn't have a sense of being uncomfortable in the body that I had, but I never really had a sense of connection like intrinsically to like my I guess sex or gender. It really was kind of like a non-issue. It was more of, okay, these things feel good, these clothing. So whether it's the fabric that feels good, you know, if it's cargo pants that are, you know, in the boy section, or if it's a dress because I like the way it, you know, flares. If it's short hair because I need less stimulation, or if it's long hair because I need some sensory input, like different aspects of life. And I have brothers. Socially, I felt that I connected more easily with males, but I just felt like, in my opinion at the time, you know, gender was like a name. Like when you're born, your parents give you a name that they really like. Whether or not that name actually suits you remains to be seen. You haven't grown up yet. You know, for some people, it does. For some people, it doesn't, and you select another one. So I thought it was like clothing, that you have to wear one. Doesn't necessarily mean it feels comfortable, you know what I mean? But it's what you're given. When I came to have a, you know, like a more expansive understanding of these things, I had some challenges because I'd always been a person who really championed, you know, as Victoria talked about the margins of the margins, I was always, you know, felt like, okay, women are often unseen, unheard. I really wanted to, you know, I gravitated to the stories of strong women throughout history, particularly in the Black community, a lot of our civil rights leaders and luminaries, and I didn't want to leave that behind. But I realized, okay, well, there's, you know, just like a person is not any one thing, like your person can be bicultural or biracial, like it's not binary. And so I realized that you know, there is a way, you know, it's not as simple, you know, so I identify as a non-binary woman because I am a non-binary person, but I also still feel an affinity for being a woman, you know, for an idea of womanhood, and therefore I use she, they pronouns because both either work for me. And I think that a lot of people, especially parents, get really anxious and concerned and weird about, you know, gender diversity or, you know, queerness when it comes, even though it's something that's very, you know, prevalent in our community. And I remember when Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network changed their name to that as opposed to Autism Women's Network, how there were people in uproar and upset, and people just really concerned and confused. And I was thinking, this is, you know, this is a disability justice issue. All of these things are part of our, you know, are relevant to our community. And so I think it's important to understand that it's not just stereotypical, like someone may, you know, I think that the dialogue about these things often doesn't take into consideration the neurodivergent perspective that person may or may not want, you know, surgical enhancements, or may not want, you know, like to present their expression can be varied. So I think it's just something that's very nuanced. And I'm just grateful that, you know, our community allows people to coin these terms and you know, and discover themselves and make these changes over time.
Thank you, Veronica. Yeah, and I related so much to what you were saying about your experiences growing up, in terms of you know, how parents identify us, and then how we experience our parents identifying us. So we're moving into the next question, which is focusing on race and ethnicity. So the question is, how does autism intersect with your racial and ethnic identity? Who would like to go first?
Veronica, I think you should go first, since my experience is very particular in that sense.
Sure, I can go first. And I wish that Kaylee was here, because I know that, you know, kind of speaking about being, you know, biracial Latina, and then, you know, a lot of work in the, you know, in the Southeast Asian community. I think it would have been a great, you know, it would have been great to hear from Kaylee. But for me, they're very interwoven. I can't, one, and there isn't one without the other. You know, I think that my race, so I'm, you know, multiply ethnic, I'm Yoruba and Cabo-Verdeano, and then my race is Black, and I live, you know, was raised in America, you know, to immigrant parents, and it has always been, I feel like in communities of color, there are often elements of neurodivergence that are kind of already kind of baked in or built in or kind of like accommodated in you know, in some ways, and in other ways very much shunned. It's like, it's a very strange dichotomy, but I feel like a large part of the reason, you know, Myles mentioned being Gen Z, I'm a little older than Xennial, so a large part of the reason I wasn't diagnosed is because of my race and my ethnicity. We didn't, you know, people with autism, whether, you know, just first people then were little white, you know, as Victoria mentioned, little white boys who liked Thomas the Train. you know what I mean? And then they became geeky teens, you know, they weren't, you know, despite the fact that the criteria, you know, are clearly met. And so, things like access to diagnosis, things like understanding of the community, things like a lot of, you know, some of the important human rights issues, they are all things that like disproportionately impact people who look like me and my children. It isn't just autism that makes me concerned about law enforcement, you know, involvement. It's also, you know, the color of my skin. The same thing with things like restraint, you know, like in schools, you know, research access, how health providers might treat you and connect with you, even with the community. Like, you know, I think a lot of discussion, for example, about topics such as ABA, take a very, very Eurocentric lens without looking at the realities that, you know, exist in communities that have already had to, unfortunately, kind of like, you know, camouflage and code switch and pick the lesser of two evils in so many different ways. And so for me, I can't, you know, when people say, why are you bringing race issues into things or ethnicity? What does this have to do with autism? It has everything to do with it. And I think that, like, I think the more that the more that our community begins to understand that, the better we'll be able to serve everyone, and, you know, and grow and, you know, address some of this, you know, longstanding persistent disparities in our community.
So in my case, I mean, I have the particular experience of being millennial from Puerto Rico. I grew up there. My parents were both college professors at the University of Puerto Rico, where I'm an alum, undergraduate alum. And to be honest, like, a big part of why I wasn't diagnosed, both between being the gifted kid that eventually later burns out as an adult, is that that's not the stereotype of what you're expecting someone to be autistic in the 1990s, basically. That's not the case. Plus, combine it with not going through the public school system, going to fancy prep schools and so on, because you are gifted. So that's not the assumption people are going to make of you. And honestly, it's probably in a way for the better, considering the fact that just about everyone I know who's had a childhood diagnosis has the trauma of being told all their childhood what they can do and won't be able to do. Whereas my parents were hyping me up. But the problem with that is that it does create a dynamic where generationally and so on, there's a lot of people, millennial and older, like anyone whose childhood started in the 1900s, so to speak, that was only really diagnosed if they were in childhood, basically, if they were the really obvious, also intellectually disabled type and so on. And whatnot, the stereotype, you know, the white boy, the and so on. And also one dynamic that we've seen, I've met among exes even, of people who are told as children that there cannot be trans because of only male kids can have Asperger's or autism or so on. So that's where I would say that, and honestly, people will say, oh, everyone in my family is normal. It's like, yeah, your grandmother who decorated the entire house with with fake strawberries and has a strong opinion of how many seconds the street lights lasting in her town is perfectly normal and neurotypical. Good. Let's roll with that. But I think there's a generational and also where you grew up gap in terms of that, honestly.
Thank you, Victoria. Myles, would you like to jump in?
Yes, and I just have to say, like, I appreciate Victoria bringing up the example of just like you're a random Thea who has an obsession with with strawberries and string. Like I know many such examples, and I think I grew up in like a second generation Cuban American family in Miami, Hialeah, Florida. And so a lot of my experience with my racial / ethnic identity and autism has to do with like also like having neurodivergent parents, but also living in like a culture where like it was just like, oh, we're just, we're just Cuban. We're just like from Miami. Um we have like we
We're
just
just
have
like
like
that.
these
That's just how
quirks.
we are. Yeah.
Yeah. And any of my friends will attest to the fact just like my household is very neurodivergent, but yeah, there wasn't any acknowledgement of it. I was first diagnosed with ADHD, but I had to do it at college when I turned 18 because my parents did not want to acknowledge it like whatsoever until I finally got diagnosed. And then with my more recent autism diagnosis, like that's a whole other can of worms. And yeah, I just like but in terms of like my specific experience, I've always been very ambiguous. Like I was always like I was never identified as autistic, but everyone always like treated me in a certain way. I because I was second generation, I wasn't quite as Latino as the kids I grew up around. And I grew up being like the racially ambiguous person and like at college as well. So it's for me, it's a lot of like existing at a margin that leaves me also like my gender identity to feel very like distance and away from it, but it's also something that like feel a special connection to. And when I get to meet like queer autistic people of color, and especially when I'm in community with like other autistic Latinas, I feel like so seen because they have these similar experiences and they know where I'm coming from. And I think in terms of anything that clinicians and non-autistic people have to be aware of is just that like you need to anticipate that if there's any social norm or any convention or any institution that you're thinking of, you need to expect that autistic people have a very particular relationship with it, and you probably don't know unless unless you're really involved in this community and you know a lot about autistic people. You need to anticipate that like you need to develop a whole new schema for how we interact with this identity, whether it's racial, gender, disability, anything.
I love this question so much because we all have very different flavors of experiences to share about race, ethnicity, and coming to our autism identity as well. And thank you so much for sharing. So we do have about, I want to reserve time for Q&A because there are some good questions coming into from the attendees. But there is another question that I hoping maybe you all can quickly respond to, if that's okay. And I'm going to combine these two questions into one. I'm putting them in the chat so everyone can see. And I'll read it out loud. So if you can respond by combining these two questions, if possible. If not, that's okay. Or pick one. Are there parts of your autism that you perceive to be less welcome or feel the need to mask in the context of academia or nonprofit or any professional space? Second question, what are some ways that we can make changes within and outside of institutions or individual spheres, such as activism or policy, as well as create change or spaces that affirm multiply marginalized autistic people? And who would like to go first?
If anyone doesn't have a preference, I could
Go for it. I'm trying to figure out how do I answer that without trash talking every single employer I've had, basically.
For real. Yes. And so I guess for me, I think that, so, autism, being autistic, it's definitely, it's an identity, it's a neurology, it's a way of being. It's also for me a disability, and I consider it a disability, a developmental disability. And I don't think disability is anything to shy away from. I know some people might not identify, that way, and that's their choice. But I think that it is expected. People expect autism to be, like everything else, expect it to be very binary. So either you are seen as having very high support needs, and your strengths are not, are minimized, or you're seen as being quote unquote almost normal, like you're neurotypical with a little spiciness, like with a little bit of neurodivergence, when that's not it. We are fully neurodivergent people. So I feel like people will they like the idea of your the way that your differences. It looks great on their grant applications and whatnot, but they don't like dealing with the reality of it. The fact that I still need these accommodations. I still have differences in communication. I still might need things to be done in a particular way, like unambiguous communication and the camera off, because or to the ability to stem, or I might still have executive functioning. Like, don't think that, oh, person A has this degree or this understanding or this experience where they can speak or whatever, so therefore it's like they want you to be like them with just a little bit of autism and not be really autistic, not really be disabled. So only come with the cutesy things that they like. You know what I mean? Like the hyperlexia, the hyperfixation, come with the things that they want, that are viable, and leave all that other stuff behind. You shouldn't be doing all that. But that's not the way that it works. And so I feel like they want you to act like, like those are those people, like, and that's not, you're not really of them, but you're not really of them. And that's not reality. And so, those are areas I feel like, there's a lot of ableism in these spaces. Sometimes they are worse than the general public. These are supposed to be quote unquote your people, and they are even, the expectations that they have, and the way that they perceive things can be so harmful.
So in my case, I've written the story about this in the Resistance and Hope Anthology by Alice. But I think a lot early in my career, when I was a lobbyist for the National LGBTQ Task Force, I was leading their disability project. I was meeting with a congressional chief of staff in DC and the Hill back, before I entered government right now. And I was trying to get her to get that member of Congress to oppose a bill that would weaken confidentiality protections, HIPAA protections for people with mental illness, all under the idea of having people, family members be able to help them, and having to explain, in the case of LGBT people, that's not exactly good for people, being able to access your mental health records. And the chief of staff for this member of Congress tells me, well, you need to understand we're talking about serious mental illnesses like bipolar and schizophrenia, which is got, scary stuff. And as I like to say, there are moments when you have a comeback in your mind that, might get you into trouble, but it's too good not to say it. Don't do that with a cop, by the way. And it was, I literally said, oh, you mean like me and my spouse who both have schizophrenia, who both have bipolar. I don't have schizophrenia in my case, but who both have bipolar disorder. And then the next 5 minutes was this poor woman trying to dig herself out of the hole of trying to say, well, if you're medicated or if you see providers or whatnot, and in the end digging deeper because she was essentially trying to say you're one of the good ones. So the question I make a lot is what makes someone one of the good ones? I was in the Hill wearing a business suit because you wear business clothes to meet with members of Congress. And I had a business card to show they look prestigious, and I have a law degree that's sitting right here. So I have letters after my name, but so that's what makes that respectability cloak makes me one of the good ones in a way. But that creates a certain pressure where you have to hide the uglier stuff. Everyone is very supportive. of diversity and disability until you start showing the uglier, scarier symptoms in a way. So it creates this pressure to be perfect because, you know, if you aren't perfect, if you aren't the well-dressed, soft-spoken, here's the diploma, and so on, then you lose that access. Basically, you become one of the scary ones, one of the non-good ones. So that pressure to perform has always been there my entire career there, honestly.
I'm so glad, Victoria, that you bring up this experience of like hiding the uglier parts of it, because I think a reality for a lot of autistic people, like, and in my case, like I grew up being a very like, as a child and teenager, I was very, quite frankly, like belligerent. I had like a very like, you know, strong sense of justice, as they say, about autistic people, and it was really hard for me to shut my mouth when I felt that something was wrong. And it even like bled into like me as like a young undergraduate student, and becoming tokenized in spaces where I was like the person to educate everyone on like, you know, queerness and just different aspects of like diversity and intersectionality. And when it came to something like upsetting me, I always felt very like silenced and being like, why are you acting this way? Why are you like making drama out of it? Why? And it's just like it's very frustrating to have to like live with that history and think that like, oh, there are parts of me that are like socially unacceptable. I find it hard to like conform to aspects of like professionalism and like, you know, respectability politics. And it's something that like as a young adult, I've learned to like get into. But I think what I need people to understand is that it is very exhausting for autistic people, and just for quite frankly anyone at the margins of society, to have to put up a front and have to deal with the neurotypicality, to deal with the whiteness. And a lot of the times we don't have like very nice like thoughts or opinions, or maybe we do, but it's still like we have like lots of like critiques or things to say, and we're not asked for those things. We're not like, when we think we speak outside of the box, we're not given that platform, or you know, we're like, oh, that's an interesting idea, and then people just like move past it. And that's what autistic people bring to the table. A lot of them, especially if they are, you know, hell-bent on like rejecting, you know, certain things in certain professional spaces. Like I think people need to anticipate that like, oh, like this person is here to transform this space. This person is here to make waves, and like we need to kind of get out of their way, quite frankly. And that was a very impassioned contribution on my part, and something that like is whatever the Generation Z energy, but it's something that like even as I go into like academic spaces and have to like perform this, you know, I want to do a PhD, like how am I going to bring this energy into like that kind of environment? Like I just need people to be aware that like this energy is coming, and it's kind of up to you to say like, I'm ready for this and I'm with it, or like you're not. And then if you're not, you're not. Yeah.
Thanks so much for anyone who's listening to our wonderful panelists' responses. I hope that you're taking notes, because if these interactions with people in the spaces that you work in, and you notice some of these pop up or observe them, I think these are valuable insights to be mindful of. So I know we have like 6 minutes left to do the Q&A of our attendees. I'm thinking perhaps maybe for our panelists, do you want to take a look at the Q&A and maybe select a question you would like to answer? And if you don't mind reading the question and then responding.
So I want to point out, I'm reading this right now, but honestly, I do want to say about connecting to the broader disability community that that one of those things is essential. Like personally, I'm a lawyer by trade. I've never actually practiced in the sense of work that requires a license. I've been more a policy person. But I would say I think a lot of what's the legal definition of disability, which is in the ADA, and it's been very clear that that autism is a disability, and thus we need to apply in any fundamental aspect all the principles of disability law. And I've been very clear that in my current government role, we're required by disability law to do so. All the principles of disability law to autism as any other disability would. And that means principles of community integration, of living in the community, of leading self-directed lives, of the community principle of the phrase "nothing about us without us," of autonomy, bodily, emotional autonomy, and so on. Essentially, that autistic people should get to lead their own lives on their own terms, essentially. And I've made it clear, well, this has been something of a topic, at least when I work with some stakeholders here in the state government, is that this is what the law mandates. Either it is a disability or it isn't, and the law considers us disabled. Therefore, we need to comply with the ADA and all, and Olmstead and all that progeny of disability law and case law. So that is my fundamental view on it, of applying the principles of disability rights to autism as any other disability. Morenike?
Yes, I was
Myles?
actually typing something really quickly. So I don't know if Myles, if you've already selected yours.
There was one question. I want to like leave space for like this conversation around disability identity. There was a question that I did want to answer that says that, are you hopeful we could navigate away from the term neurotypical and have, neurodiverse or neurodivergency be assumed the norm? And I responded that I typed this in the chat earlier. I don't know if it's like seen, but I said, I think the best case scenario is people understanding neurotypicality instead of this like discrete category of like, this is a neurotypical person and this is who they are and how they function, moving away from that and understanding neurotypicality as a set of norms and ultimately like adjacency to whiteness and your ability to function in a normative capitalist productive setting. And the idea that like those norms really don't exist, and beginning to understand neurotypicality as like a hierarchy that exists in our society and just another means of social stratification.
Okay, so I typed a quick response about the disability identity, and basically, so people can read it because I know we're here all the time, but I feel like it's kind of like Candace Owens is Black, but are you really Black? You know what I mean? You are, but you know what I mean? So I feel like there's a lot of growth, areas of growth in the autistic community with regard to like cross disability stuff in in beyond theory and beyond, oh, the ADA will get me these these accommodations for my job and so forth. I think that we have an area to grow. I think it becomes kind of seems to be very siloed. With these other questions that are here, I think that recent literature is trying to reflect what what is seen, what community preferences have been identified as people using person first language. Both person first and identity first language are valid. Like I know that some people view person first language as stigmatizing, and I think that to do so erases the lengthy history of person first language and the multiple disabilities people have, and the amount of work. We're all sitting on those people's coattails. We're all benefiting from the work of those people. And I think the problem is how you view yourself, not the term you use. You can call yourself an autistic person all day long and be steeped in internalized ableism and hate yourself. And you can call yourself a person with autism and have a very neurodiversity affirming, way of thinking. So I think it's, I think you need to understand that outside of the United States and a lot of communities of color and other disabilities, because people are not just autistic, we're not a monolith. A person might use person first language, and I think that we should honor however a person chooses to identify. It's the reason for the terminology that's more than the terminology that I think that we should be concerned with.
That was awesome. Thank you so much for wrapping that up so quickly, Marinike. Yeah, and we are at time. It's been such an honor having the three of you come and talk. Sadaf, do you want to come on and talk about Kaylee's contribution on the side?
Yes, thank you very much, everyone, for being here, for your incredible contributions. Kaylee has been a very active participant in putting the panel together, like I mentioned at the very beginning. And Kaylee will be sharing a recorded response to a lot of these incredible questions, and we will be posting that on our website. So in the interest of time, just want to thank everyone. I have put the feedback survey in the link for anyone to give us any feedback. We're always welcome. And Victoria, Myles, Jenny, Morenike, thank you very much. This was beyond incredible. The recording is going to be posted on our website. Thank you very much. Have a great rest of the afternoon, everyone.